Okay, so I apologize for this video format, but my audio on my computer seems to have stopped working, so sometimes you have to do what you have to do. So I was assigned Chapter 12, which is Other Models. It reviews 3 different models, and so that's what we're going to be discussing, 3 different models. So number 1 is the Discussions of Moral Dilemmas by Lawrence Kohlberg. Secondly is Teaching Strategies for Thinking and Feeling by Frank E. Williams. And lastly, it's a promising new model, the Prism of Learning model, which is actually developed by the author of our textbook. First up is model number 1, the Discussions of Moral Dilemmas. So here's the idea with this learning model. It's a strategy to develop ethical and moral reasoning in learners. Notice how it's an emphasis on teaching reasoning skills and determining how a student comes to a conclusion and hoping that it's ethically right and not trying to indoctrinate any kind of premeditated virtue in students. This was developed because Hartshorne and May came up with they discovered something very interesting, and that was that Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and students who are involved with religious education or other programs emphasizing moral ethical behavior, they do not behave more ethically than children who are not involved with these programs. And so Lawrence Kohlberg paid special attention to this, and he responded to the failure of these programs to instill youth in ethics by creating this model of moral dilemmas. He also disagreed with the idea of ethical relativity, and ethical relativity is the idea that there are no universal truths, and what is virtuous is relative to what society you grew up in and what your culture believes. He believes that there are universal truths that need to be taught in schools. And so there are also values relating to personal choice, such as how to dress or what to do with your free time. Those are all deemed to be equally appropriate and yet different depending on society. But universal truths, they are not equal to these elements of choice. So here's the contradiction in these moral dilemmas. So Kohlberg believes students should uphold universal ethical principles, but they should also go through a process of ethical reasoning to determine their own ethical values. So therefore, even though students are not being told what to believe, there is a hope that they will come to respect these universal truths. So for example, a student could decide after careful consideration that blacks should be slaves because they are inferior. But through the guidance in this moral reasoning program, the students should discover this is not appropriate and that slavery is definitely universally wrong. Discussions of moral dilemmas. How do you do this? Here's the process. The objective here is to get students to determine and identify their own values. First of all, that's called reason synthesis. Secondly, is to have students scrutinize existing high ideals and evaluate their appropriateness. This is called values clarification. And then in general, to develop other high-level reasoning skills. So here are some steps to implement this process. Basically, you have a group of students in a class, and you present the dilemma as the teacher. This can be done in a variety of ways. For example, you could list statements about an issue on the board and have students agree, disagree, or can't decide and explain their reasoning. Keeping in mind that these dilemmas can be hypothetical or drawn from the community, society, or the world. They can reflect other school content, so they're highly integratable. So you could talk about, was Paul Revere tattling that the British are coming ethical, for example, integrated with history. And dilemmas, they will often feature a protagonist trying to make a decision or take action. Okay, so the second step after you present the dilemma is to have students reiterate and kind of clarify facts and identify issues in the dilemma. They're figuring out what is the problem here and what actions can be done to take care of this problem. So the students will then think about it themselves, choose an action for the protagonist to take depending on what the problem is, write down different courses of action regarding the problem. And while students are doing this, the teacher needs to observe and assess patterns in student thinking and kind of be prepared for the next steps of this process. So the teacher should have an idea of what the students are writing down. Next, the students need to convene in small groups. The teacher should divide the class into these groups, and students shouldn't choose their own groups. Here's the reason why. After determining what the general consensus is for the dilemma, teachers should make an effort to divide groups. First of all, if there's an uneven split on the issue in the class, you need to divide the students into groups with the same position. But if there's an even split on the issue, like some for or against, organ donation or something, you divide the students into groups with equal representation of positions. So I think this is done because if there are very few students who support one side of an idea, you don't want them to be overwhelmed or bullied by other people, by other students in the group. So if there is an uneven distribution of beliefs, you put the ones who are the majority together first so that those who are the minority can still have a voice before convening into a large group, which is the next step. The class will reconvene for a full class discussion. Students all sit in a circle. The students present their ideas and conclusions. And the teacher, even though the teacher is mostly listening throughout this process, they need to create a comfortable atmosphere, but also keep the discussion focused on providing reasoning for conclusions. So we don't want students just tangenting into stories about their childhood, for example. The teacher should remain neutral and encourage full participation from all points of view, but most of all, the teacher's role is to ask provocative questions to develop higher level reasoning skills in learners. That's the goal here, to develop reasoning skills. These questions should be prepared in advance, but they may also develop during the discussion. This is highly important. The teacher definitely needs to have thought-provoking questions prepared, because as we'll see at the end of the section, that without these teacher providing questions, this method of teaching is rather ineffective. So lastly, after the group discussion, students should privately write down an answer regarding what the protagonist should do and provide reasoning. Students should not be coaxed into a consensus, like they should not have to decide what is ultimately true or not. But they should be given the opportunity, after hearing multiple perspectives, to reevaluate their thoughts and record it. Regarding evaluation, teachers should not be assessing for a right or wrong answer. They should instead be assessing for development of reasoning skills, or looking for holes, I call it. So they should be looking to see if a student truly took their point of view and examined it from many different angles, or can you still poke holes in it? And that'll be a sinking ship if there's lots of holes. Okay, so regarding this model, here's the strengths. It's very student-centered. It allows for independence. It's an authentic experience or real-world application sort of scenario. Though this method can be hypothetical, you could easily apply it to lots of different ethical controversies in the real world. And that is particularly attractive to gifted students. It fosters abstract reasoning, so you have to put yourself in a situation that you may not have experienced yourself. And it should introduce a variety of worldviews, so you could talk about something that is not accepted in our culture but is in another culture, for example. And it's highly customizable, so regarding assessment or portrayal of what students decide, they could act it out, or they could write an essay, or they could create a PowerPoint. The method of presentation of what students decide varies greatly, so it's great for differentiation. Here's some weaknesses, though. It's highly dependent on quality questioning and sequencing by the teacher. So don't just think you throw a bunch of students into a group and say, discuss this big idea. The teacher needs to carefully prepare questions and anticipate what students might be thinking, because the teacher needs to challenge their cognitive functions in order for the students to grow. So I believe the term is disequilibrium. The students have to be thrown into disequilibrium so they can kind of readjust the pieces and come up with something new. Secondly, the research on this model is mostly done on boys and men. So the suggestions for making this model successful are highly based on how men and boys reason, which is proven to be different from how girls and women reason. So that's just important to keep in mind, that this model could be biased in terms of effectiveness because it was mostly tested on boys and men. Here's model number 2. This model is kind of vague is the best way I can talk about it. It's very abstract, so I'm going to try and make sense of it for you and then give you some examples of how it can be applied. But here's the main idea for model number 2, which is strategies for thinking and feeling. So it's a model, it's a strategy to enhance creativity and productivity, to put it blatantly. It combines these 3 basic elements: curriculum, teaching strategies, and student behaviors. So vague. This sounds like it could be any kind of model, really. But here's some history on it before we dive into what this really is. It was developed by Frank E. Williams, with most of the work being done primarily in 1970 and 1972. Mr. Williams valued creativity in students and saw it as absolutely necessary to develop and utilize often. The model he developed, and I quote, provides a vehicle for intersecting a given subject area with any teaching strategy to produce student behavior that is creative. So basically, how can we get students to think creatively across content areas? So here's the process. You need to implement the following ideas across content areas to develop creative thinking in students. Number 1, here's an idea to try across content areas. Explore discrepant events and information. So identify or develop known unknowns, as I call them. Let's talk about all the things that we don't know in the world. So here's an example. It's clearer this way. Brainstorm questions to ask someone from another country. Or list ways of life, or list how life would be different if one lived in a clear glass house. Here's another strategy to try in content areas to grow creativity. Ask and seek answers to provocative questions. Why can't this be applied in so many situations? Yes, it can. Ask questions to get students excited about new things. This sounds pretty standard. Here's an example. Have students examine an acorn carefully and then ask them what the world will be like if there were no more seeds. So this is kind of like combining the first strategy, explore discrepant events and information. It's combining it with provocative questions. Next, explore examples of change and habit. The world is always changing. We need to emphasize this to students, especially gifted students. It's a main idea to focus on an essential question instead of something to memorize. Here's an example. Talk about items that people preserve and why they preserve them. Question why motors are always on the front of cars, or consider why the United States uses Fahrenheit even though the rest of the world uses Celsius for the most part. Next, to develop skills of search. This doesn't mean, how to help students find reliable resources necessarily. Instead, it's just very generically ways to find information. So find ways things were done in the past. So consider what a historical perspective would be regarding information. You can find new information through trial and error, try new things to discover an answer. And then there's experimental ways of finding information where you conduct a controlled experiment and see what happens. Next, build a tolerance for ambiguity. The world is a giant gray zone. Unless you are Kohlberg, most of the world believes that there isn't a universal right and universal wrong, though I suppose that could be debated as well. But present challenging situations with opportunities for open-ended responses. At an elementary school level, you could try this example. Read a story and stop at a turning point. Have students write what may happen next. discuss if there's a right or a wrong way to end a story. So you would be challenging, is it necessary to have a happy ending, for example? Next, you should be teaching for development rather than for adjustment. So I think the modern way or the current way to talk about this is called having a growth mindset. So you want to emphasize learning from mistakes and talk about how accidents can be positive. Many of the greatest thinkers in history went through a process of rises and falls and failures and successes, and students need to recognize that it is okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them. So here's an example. Read a biography about the Wright brothers and reflect on how many attempts to fly were made before the success at Kitty Hawk. That is my dog crying in the background. 7. Encourage students to evaluate situations. Quite vague, but I'll try and make this specific for you. Present a situation needing careful consideration of results and consequences. So have students examine a box of items and talk about which ones will likely sink or float. Afterwards, discuss patterns in their choices. So give students an open-ended situation to evaluate. And then once the evaluation is done, talk about the patterns that were chosen to evaluate and talk about what it reveals. Next, during the use of the 7 strategies, it's important to consider student behavior patterns. So as you're posing these challenges to your students to help them learn, their behaviors can tell you an awful lot about how successful your teaching is. So these behaviors are separated into cognitive, which are intellectual, or affective, which is feeling. Cognitive pupil behaviors. The first one is fluency in thinking. These students who have these behaviors, they almost always come up with more than one answer, example, question, or idea. Next, there is flexible thinking. The student can apply an idea or concept in many different ways across content areas. So that's another behavior to look at. Next, original thinking. Some students think of unique or even deviant ideas or solutions often. They just like to challenge things and come up with new ways of doing things. Next, we have elaborative thinking. The student doesn't generate new ideas necessarily, but greatly expands upon or embellishes existing ideas. Next, effective pupil behaviors. So, curiosity. The student likes to wonder, explore, and ask questions. Second is imagination. The student visualizes or dreams about situations they have never experienced themselves that don't already exist in reality or can't exist in reality, so quite imaginative. Next, complexity. The student likes to decipher intricate problems or work independently without help. So this would be the student who is wants to work alone and wants to let his or her own ideas develop and tackle a task independently. Risk-taking. This student is willing to make guesses and is not afraid of criticism or afraid of being right or wrong. Next up, teaching strategies for thinking and feeling. The strengths of this model. It is rather open-ended. It requires freedom of choice. It's cross-curricular, so you can develop it across areas. It's very student-centered, so the teacher, apart from posing questions, should not be involved. And it also aims to develop specific behaviors and feelings. Teaching strategies for thinking and feeling, the weaknesses. It's highly ambiguous. So this model, as I was going through it, you might think, well, this doesn't really sound like a model at all. And that's because it's not really. It's like a way of thinking or behaviors to recognize as being part of learning. Next, there isn't any evidence that this actually works. It's just kind of, I don't want to say wishful thinking, but since it's so ambiguous and hasn't been tested, it's difficult to apply, but also easy to apply because a lot of these things are already existent in lessons that we do every day. Lastly, Prism of Learning. This model is quite unique in that it's very, very new. It's a model that is a strategy to allow students to develop their own specific gifts, talents, and skills. It's mostly done through creative problem solving. Creativity is considered an important part of overall intelligence, or at least this is an idea that's accepted highly in this model. It requires a blend of 5 cognitive skills called general capacities. And next there are 10 content areas, that's the closest way I can describe them, called human abilities. More uniquely so, it is created by the author of our book, Maker, and Anu Ruth Wong. This model is still evolving, so it's not fully developed, but I will go over the general idea for you. It's highly dependent on the learning center. So the learning environment, that is the crown jewel of this model. Like if this model was integrated into schools, like schools would have to be designed completely differently. Even just the space, how they're set up, they would have to be rebuilt, reestablished. So this learning center, it's a space focused on exploration of human abilities, which is that content, well, those 10 areas of content. And it has different centers of exploration within this learning center. So you could imagine students moving from station to station, different center to center, and each of these centers is focused on a human ability. Next, the assessment is done through observation of students at stations in the Learning Center. So there would be an expert or a reliable adult at each of the stations. You could picture a teacher at each station that guides and fosters the learning, though it's highly student-centered. So as I'm reading through this model, I'm not led to believe in any capacity that the teacher is, has any kind of lesson for the student. The student develops their own ideas, as is the basis for this model, and the teacher is there kind of as a coach. So these general capacities that I mentioned earlier, these are the skills needed to explore the content, or these 10 areas of human abilities. The first one is simply remembering. You need to be able to remember things and apply them to different situations. You need to be creative, especially in problem solving. You need to develop a reasoning to explain your conclusions, and you need to be able to metacognate as well. So reflect on your learning process and have a growth mindset. And lastly, unusually, intuition, a very qualitative aspect, our general capacity. We're so used to in education being told you have to have very tangible proof or very tangible observable skills, but in this model, intuition is valued. So the inherent feeling that people have to go one way or another, it should be valued and attempted to be measured. Okay, so human abilities. There are 10 areas of study, aka human abilities, that students can explore in the Prism of Learning model. Students, imagining them in this learning center, they move around to different stations. Sometimes students can choose which human ability they want to explore, so it really depends on what the student values. And sometimes students are rotated through all the centers, especially during an assessment day or assessment period. This is to be sure that the student receives a balanced education as well as one that is catered to their unique gifts. Students exercise the 5 general capacities at each station, so they use those different skills to explore these human abilities. Okay, so the first human ability is social and humanitarian. So in this particular learning ability or human ability, you explore how to communicate with others and how to get along with others. So in this model, learning to get along with people and communicate through whatever means is highly valued because of how interdependent our world is. Next, a student explores the emotional human ability, which is how to handle one's own emotions and the emotions of others. Next, mathematical or symbolic human abilities. So you study math, just general math, working with numbers, but also symbolic meanings. So, how can I say this? So, ways of thought that one hasn't experienced already that can be represented quantitatively. The next human ability is scientific and natural. So the students at this station learn through observation of the natural world, and they also come up with experiments to test aspects of the natural world. The next human ability is somatic or bodily. I would also say kinesthetic is a word we'd be more familiar with. And this isn't like just a gym class that students attend, because that might be the closest thing that we have to it in our current education model, but it's expression through the body and through the senses. So this isn't just exercising, it's using the body to express ideas. Next, we have visual and spatial. So in this particular human ability, students learn how to create images or models to represent ideas. So this station might be greatly appreciated by a visual learner, so a learner who would choose to make a poster as their vessel of expression. Similarly, there is the auditory or sonnets human ability. So students at this station would learn to manipulate sounds to express ideas, which if you think about it, that's what music is. Next, verbal and linguistic. So learning how to use words effectively to entertain, persuade, or inform others. How to get your ideas into the world using words. Mechanical and technical. This is kind of like the trades section of the Learning Center. So students learn how to repair and manipulate machines or computers. They learn these very technical abilities that are highly practical in the world. These might be for students who don't really want to deal with or learn about abstract ideas and want to work with their hands on something they can touch and feel and manipulate. Lastly, this is interesting, spiritual human ability. You need to be able to develop mental awareness. So you need to be able to see beyond the material world, determine what's important to you, determine what is virtuous. Similarly to Model 1, determine what these universal truths are and determine how you feel about them. Competencies. So this model sounds very new age and progressive in that it sounds like students just go from station to station and learn about what they want to learn about. But in reality, there is guidelines here, so they're called competencies. Traditional learning settings force content and thinking processes to be learned in a specific order. In this model, the PRISM model recognizes knowledge and skills are connected and interdependent on each other. Therefore, learning experiences are separated by themes in this learning model. So instead of saying student will be able to do this, this, and this by the end of the lesson as an irregular objective, students should be able to explore and indulge in, for example, in grades kindergarten through second grade, individuality, patterns, change, cycles. In 6th to 8th grade, maybe culture, exploration, ideas of extinction, things aren't around forever, those ideas, and even moving up the ladder, beauty. What an interesting idea to study at a higher level. You can study beauty in regards to the Fibonacci sequence in math, why we're so attracted to this particular ratio. Or in beauty, for example, as well. How do different cultures perceive things as being beautiful? What's a beautiful idea? What's a beautiful physical representation? So each of these themes, of these big ideas, can be applied across content areas. So therefore, integration is immensely important in this model, and it doesn't separate each of the subjects into a different area. It's a learning center where everything is connected together and united by these themes. So how do you figure out if students are learning things in this model? Here's what is said about assessment. It's all done through observation by a station expert. So there are experts who document student products through photos, videos, and notes at each station. I'm picturing kind of like a zookeeper, forgive my analogy, but looking over the animals and taking down observations from day to day and keeping record of what they're doing. Students, they create portfolios with examples of products that they're interested in regarding the themes, and using those skills and within those human content areas. They also reflect on their ideas and they self-evaluate. So very, very student-centered. Students work with teachers, and the teachers, they compile information from their observations in the portfolio and evaluate a student's strengths and weaknesses. So a student doesn't necessarily have to be extremely proficient in every single content area. It's recognized that some students are just inherently better at things than others, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a equal and balanced education. It just means that this model is accepting that some people are just gifted in some things and some are not. And I use gifted loosely. I should say talented in some things and others are not. Though of course talents can be honed, but that's another discussion. And after a student is evaluated, teachers or experts work together to just find ways to challenge, foster, and aid development as a coach, and not really as someone who says, okay, we've determined your weakness, now jump through these hoops to get better. Lastly, in regards to this model, family and community is highly important. So the Learning Center must be open and connected to parents and families. This model understands that families and parents have a huge influence on student development. So families and parents are a student's first teacher, and what is done at home, it's an enormous indicator of success later in life and how a student even becomes gifted or not. It starts at home. Intelligence is fluid, and what is done during the first couple of years of life can change a student's level of intelligence. So the community should value the Learning Center. Community members should volunteer in the Learning Center and create authentic learning experiences. As often as possible, the community should be involved with this Learning Center. I'm picturing it as the sun and everything else orbits around it. So it's a kind of a romanticized ideal world in which these learning centers occur in some ways. So if this were to really be implemented, it would almost be, in my mind, like an experimental community, as in The Giver. Of course, I could be romanticizing it as well. It's really just such a far cry from what we're doing now, but also such a wonderful cry from what we're doing now. So that's it, the 3 models offered in Chapter 12. I hope you enjoyed, and please do feel free to message me with questions. My reference is the textbook. Thanks.